Welcome to the Podcast Interview Marketing Show, where we explore big ideas with leading experts on how to grow your brand and business with targeted podcast interviews.
Have you ever wondered why your podcast interviews aren't converting? You have a great discussion and then you hope they convert. Well, hope is not a strategy. And today, Jessica and Tiffany are going to detail welcome pages. Welcome pages are something we've tested over the last 9 years and a key component, not only in the attribution of traffic, but also making sure that you've got a system to move people from being a passive listener to an active visitor to an engaged lead. I'll let them give all the details here.
Thanks, Tom. Well, I am so excited to get to speak with you today, Tiffany. You are our interview valet, resident welcome page guru. And so I think you're going to be able to provide so much information and valuable resources for the audience. And so first, let's start from the beginning. Can you explain to us a little bit about what a podcast interview welcome page is?
Absolutely, Jessica. This is probably a question we get so much, even from high level, CMOs, COOs of companies, right, who've been in marketing for a long time. And they come to us. They've done podcast interviews for a long time, and they are still like, what is a welcome page? And I think that's because it's not really a super common practice in the marketing world. It's not like, oh, we know we need to be on social media, or we know that we need to email our list or go on podcasts to talk about our company and our brand and everything. But welcome pages is a little, maybe that's something specific to us at Interview Valet, but absolutely. So a podcast interview welcome page is basically a non-indexed page on your website, customized for each podcast interview that you do. It has some information about you, resources and different things, and it's a pretty scaled down page, just some information about you, maybe some calls to action, and that's it. Customized for those leads from your podcast interviews.
Awesome. So it sounds a lot to me like a landing page. Is that pretty much the same thing, or are there some differences between the two?
Yeah, they're different from a landing page, or some people call them a sales page or a squeeze page. Those are typically just bare bones pages, right, that have some information, going back to they're called a sales page sometimes. They're usually driving to download this guide or sign up for my free webinar or something, right? It's just information specifically to that topic. Whereas the key element to a welcome page that makes it different than a landing page is that it still has all of your header and footer of your primary website, right? So it has all the main navigation on there. It has all of your links, your about me, all of that there. And and that really ties into the purpose of a welcome page. So if someone listens to you on a podcast, right, for 30 plus minutes, they've already kind of opted into you, right? They're curious, they want to learn more. You give them the opportunity to go to this welcome page, and then they come over there. They're learning about you, right? You might be new to them. Your company is new to them. And that goes back to the difference as well, is that it's not just a sales page, download this guide or sign up for my free webinar. It's about making a connection, right? And that's really the focus of everything that's on the page, right? So I would say that's the two biggest differences that makes it not a landing page.
And I would assume that there's probably key elements that kind of add to the effectiveness of this page. Can you share with us what some of those key elements might be?
Absolutely. And this is something that, in 9 years of our business, we have defined and refined over time. Our founder, Tom, he's gone on lots of podcast interviews himself. So we've had a lot of opportunity over the last 9 years to identify what makes a good welcome page and what should be there and what's not necessary. One of them is that I just discussed of the navigation, right? You want that there. They're coming there. Maybe they come on your page and they want to see about you, or maybe your case studies, or maybe some other resources that you have. And that's why having that header and footer there of your primary website is important. So that's one element. And there's 6 others to consider that we factor into creating our welcome pages. Another one is the URL, right? You want it to be the main URL of your website. So us, for example, we are interviewvalet.com. And then you'll concise, you'll come up with a title for a podcast interview that you've done, and you will make a unique URL with that. So that's another factor, is having a nice clean URL directed to your primary website. The other ones is the page opens immediately with welcome, the name of the podcast listener, and the podcast art right there. So that immediately you're still kind of in that stage of building trust with that lead from the podcast interview. So you're immediately affirming, okay, I'm in the right spot, right? They may not know you from Adam prior to this, and they're immediately like, okay, I see the podcast art of the show. I know I'm in the right spot. The next part is you go into almost like a letter. And this is where the page, I would say, is unique too, in that it's not written like normal marketing sales copy. It is more written like an open letter. You're introducing yourself. You're making that connection like, oh, you must have heard my interview on, we'll say Tom's interview, Eventual Millionaire, right? So it's almost like if you're meeting someone, an acquaintance at a party, right? Oh, I know you from so-and-so, from Jessica Morgan. Nice to meet you. So it goes into that. It talks about what you do, maybe, ways that you can serve them. And then it goes into maybe their pain points, what obstacles they're having and how you can help them. Flowing into that is probably an element that might get overlooked. It might seem kind of easy to, it might seem silly, but we also encourage putting your headshot on there. That's another one. If you consider it, podcasts are primarily listened to audio only. So this might be their first chance to put a face with a name, a face with a voice, and let them get to know you better. Another element is your all of your contact information, right? Your social media handles, maybe a link to your email or an email box with your company, something like that. And something with that, we also encourage to put all of the social media handles that you have, all of the platforms that you use, not just your favorites, right? Because if we go back to the purpose of the page is to meet your listener where they are, right? And so maybe LinkedIn is your favorite social media platform to network with others, but maybe they prefer Facebook or Instagram. So any social media account that you have, we encourage putting that on there. And then the bottom, the final one, and this is probably the one that we get the most confusion about and questions about, and that is the calls to action, right? And I say calls to action plural because we have found that 3 calls to action in the landscape of podcast interview marketing really bodes best for nurturing those relationships and meeting your listeners where they are, right? And we call those 3 calls to action. We have a small yes, a medium yes, and a large or a heck yes, as we call it. And it's all different tiers of where you can they can meet you where they are, right? Maybe they just want to download a quick guide or do a quick assessment. If they're even right for your services, your middle might be it's a medium yes, right? It's a low entry. It's a little bit more time consuming or costly, but so like a book, download a free copy of my book, right? It's free, but it's still a time investment for them to opt into that, right? And then the heck yes, we say that's the people who show up credit card in hand, right? They have already decided they're what you want. For us, we use a free discovery call, like a consultation. And while that's free, it doesn't cost them anything. If you break down the cost of what your COO or CEO of a company's 30-minute or hourly consultation rate is, that is an investment for the company to offer that. Um, but we have found people who take that are already pretty serious and they're pretty close to being a good fit, right? So all of that to say, those 7 things are what we have found to be the good key elements of a podcast interview welcome page.
I love that. And I think the greatest thing, like I heard you say, was the fact that we've been able to tweak it over the last 9 years, right? Like, so we have been able to tweak it to be like, this works, this doesn't work. And I know just, from past clients of seeing really what works and how to kind of convert those listeners into leads. And I think that, heck yes, they're already primed. They're ready to go. And I also love the fact that we can use the host's know, like, trust to our benefit, to, having the host's information on there as well. So I love that. So how does having a dedicated podcast interview welcome page contribute to really the overall success of the marketing strategy, particularly for those, maybe individuals or businesses who are looking to leverage podcast appearances as a marketing strategy?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest thing is what you just touched on is building that know, like, trust. Not only with the listeners and the leads from the podcast interview, but also the host. It's showing that you're going that extra mile. And that's where it's one of the areas that we differentiate between podcast guesting and podcast interview marketing, right? It's not just showing up on a podcast, talking for 30, 45 minutes and walking away and you're done. It's going that extra mile of building relationships. And you also think about it from your listener's point of view, right? They're on a show. You reference this website on your page, right? Go to interviewvalet.com/EM for eventual millionaire. You go over there and they're like, wow, like they took the time to create a whole page on their website for that interview. It shows you're invested too, from a leads perspective, as a potential client's perspective. It shows they're interested in you, like they're invested in serving you. Right. Because they didn't have to do that. They didn't have to take that extra time, plan ahead of time, know the page ahead of time. So I think that's part of it. And just that key element of building the know, like, and trust.
And so I would assume with that, you have people kind of funneling into the different calls to actions and such. So have you found that guests have been able to use these welcome pages to identify shows or maybe audiences that resonate with their message better than maybe other podcasts?
Absolutely. And part of that is you can track, on the back end of your website, you can track page visits and site visits, right? You may start to see trends, right? We see this a lot of clients that come to us early on who maybe they're new to podcasting. And over time, they'll get some data that they never had access to before. We actually had one client who was a CPA, right? And over time of working with us, discovered that his message on podcast really resonated with dentists, right? He never had a specific vertical per se. He, was a CPA. And so then he leaned into that, right? Okay, like this audience really likes what I have to say. So then he started going on more dental niche podcast and found that that's a really big audience that really, liked what he had to say. And that was something that he may not have otherwise discovered without tracking the data on the back end and maybe site visits and different things. So, and we've seen that with other clients too. It really helps to identify who really likes what you have to say, and who really likes what you have to offer.
Absolutely. And I feel like I know I've heard that story. Definitely. Tom shared it before. And it's more so about not the bigger is better podcast, right? You have Okay, now, we've narrowed this down. Maybe this niche works for me. And then it becomes those leads are like fish in a barrel. You're shooting fish in a barrel and you're like, here we go. Dentist, this is what I want to go on. And we're just really focusing on that. So I love the power of welcome pages. So switching perspectives for a second, what do podcast hosts think of welcome pages? Do you think the podcast hosts themselves can benefit from them at all?
I think so, because for a couple reasons. For one, I think it nurtures that relationship, right, with the host. They also don't want somebody that is maybe just taking advantage of their audience, of their resources, and not giving anything back. And I think that's probably a big misconception that we come across a lot, is that promoting podcast interviews is a one-way street. It's all on the shoulders of the podcast host, and that's really not the truth. It should be a two-way street, right? So I think when you show up on a podcast interview and you're like, "Hey, I'm going to reference this site," it shows to them that you take it seriously as well, and that you take their time and their audience and resources seriously. So I think it nurtures that aspect. And another thing with that is, we always say, podcast host, no other podcast host, right? You will get a reputation as being a good guest on a podcast, right? And they'll tell their friends and their friends. And so it helps with that as well. They're like, "Hey, this guest Jessica, she's great. Like, she promotes the interview. She dedicates a whole page on their website to your audience." So I think it helps that as well. Um, and another benefit is just promoting their show, right? Your podcast, their podcast art, their name, the show's name. So it helps that too, right? Because that also builds trust with their listeners. Like, oh, the eventual millionaire connected me with Interview Valet. Like, it builds that relationship too there with their audience as well. So I think there's major benefit for the host, and I think it adds value for them as well.
Absolutely. And I feel like everybody wants to be a good guest, right? We all want to be a good guest for the podcast host, but it's like welcome pages will almost take you from being a good guest to a gracious guest, a great guest that they want to have back on again. And so I can definitely see that, setting yourself apart by doing those welcome pages. So I know one of the largest challenges our clients always have, or questions they have as well, is tracking ROI. And in the podcast landscape, that is incredibly difficult. And so you already kind of touched on this with, getting kind of the back end of analytics and such, but is there any other way that welcome pages may help support those looking to track their success through podcast guesting?
Yeah, absolutely. So the one I referenced earlier, the CPA and the dental podcast, right? That's one way, because you can track on the back end again. And a rebuttal, I just had this from a client a couple weeks ago. They were like, "Oh, within 30 days or 60 days, this interview is old news anyway," right? And I was like, actually, that's not true. I do the welcome pages for Tom, our CEO and founder. And I still see hits from his interviews from 5+ years ago on our page. And I think, what's the number? It's about 80% of listens of an episode are done within the first 30 days. But that still leaves 20% that may not find you from 5 years from now. I'm sure we all in our lives have listened to a podcast, and you look and you see the date and you're like, "Wow, that was like from 3 years ago. I had no idea." So, and we go that goes back to, like, podcasts aren't really evergreen per se, but we reference them to, like, they have the shelf life of a can of soup, right? Got a few years in there that you're going to find people with them. And I think that goes back to the ROI, right? And tracking over time. um it also goes into, like, podcast interview marketing is a long game, right? It's not just, "I'm going to do this for 2 months and quit." Um, and then with that, you get momentum. And just like we've seen, right? Just a silly example of something going viral. That happens because you're seeing this idea everywhere, right? I saw it on this podcast, and then I saw a clip over here on this podcast. So it's building this cumulative idea around your business. And then welcome pages on the back end let you see that, right? And you might, maybe your idea, you came up with an idea, right? And then 2 years later, it catches on and now everybody's talking about this idea. You might see an uptick in that interview because now it's like circulating again, right? Or it became popular again. So I think that's our biggest thing about tracking the ROI. Like you said, that's a big kickback that we get from people in the community. And it's really the best way that we've nailed down to track that ROI, right? Because otherwise, who's to say how they landed on your site? But if you know, if they go to that welcome page, they're there because they heard that interview and heard that specific URL mentioned within the interview.
Absolutely. And then they have that evergreen page to go to. It looks the same, which is great. So, well, as we wrap up here, I know there's probably a lot of listeners that are like, that sounds great, but I don't even know how to get started. Do you have any recommended resources for designing a welcome page that maybe would give our listeners kind of an idea of what they should look like?
So we actually have a resource that lays down those 7 key elements that I mentioned earlier. Step by step, we show a great example of our welcome page. And let's try this on for size. So go over to the show's page, podcastinterviewmarketing.com. And over there, within the show notes of this episode, I will put a link to our resources for a welcome page where it's all written down on a 2-page guide of what to do and how to, make them on your site, and also how to make them easy, put them in automation that, it's not so tedious to be creating web pages every other week on your site for your interviews. So go check that out. And I hope you guys find that beneficial.
Awesome. So it's podcastinterviewmarketing.com.
Yes.
And it'll also be in the show notes. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Tiffany.
All right. Thanks, Jessica.
Well, there you have it. Jessica and Tiffany detailed everything we've learned over the last 9 years in building a welcome page that attracts people, engages them, and converts them. It's the only way you're going to be able to actually attribute your traffic. And we know that things that you can measure, you can improve. If you want to see what one looks like, make sure you go to the show notes and check that out. Now, the quote I want to leave with you today is something that we use at Interview Valet a lot. It's one of those Tomisms, and it's that hope is not a strategy. You can go on a podcast and hope you're talking to the right audience, hope they convert, hope you can make the most out of it. But much better, instead of doing podcast guessing, do podcast interview marketing.